learning a new language changes how you think. You've probably heard this phrase before, maybe in a language learning ad, maybe in a TED talk, or maybe from that one friend who spent 2 weeks in Barcelona and now just can't shut up about their Spanish personality. The idea that Japanese will somehow rewire your brain or that Portuguese will completely change your personality is incredibly appealing, especially if your current personality sucks. While this concept has captured our imagination for decades, the reality is a little more complicated and maybe even more interesting. In this video, we'll dive into what's called the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, or linguistic relativity. We'll look at some examples of how different languages describe the world, like how some Aboriginal languages don't use left and right, or how Russians might see blues differently than English speakers. But more importantly, we separate fact from fiction. What does science actually tell us about a language and thought? Does learning a new language really change how you think, or is something else going on? Let's start with what linguistic relativity actually means. The basic idea is that a language influences how you think and how you perceive the world, which sounds reasonable and pretty cool, to be honest. This idea was popularized by linguists Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf. However, they actually never co-authored any works and never stated their ideas in terms of hypothesis, but we somehow still discuss this idea 100 years later. It even comes in two flavors, a strong version and a weak version. The strong version, also called linguistic determinism, suggests that language completely determines how you think. This is the one you see in science fiction. Like in the movie Arrival, where learning an alien language gives you the ability to see the future. I must admit my Spanish is not quite there yet.
I was doing some reading about this idea that if you immerse yourself into a foreign language that you can actually rewire your brain.
The Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. The theory that it's the theory that the language you speak determines how you think and...
Yeah, it affects how you see everything. It was, I'm curious, are you dreaming in their language?
So this strong version has been pretty thoroughly debunked over the years. One of the most famous examples is that Whorf claimed that the Hopi language doesn't share our concept of time. That is until Eckhard Malotki dropped a 600-page book literally called Hopi Time. Some neo-Whorfians still disagree with the results of this book though, and that is something that linguists do all the time, disagreeing. But anyway, there's a weaker version of this hypothesis that we will mostly focus on in this video. It suggests that language influences rather than determines how we think. This is where things get a little more complex, but also where evidence starts to show up. The Newspeak in Orwell's 1984, one of my favorite books ever by the way, is actually a perfect example of how these two versions differ. Some interpret it as the deterministic version. The idea that removing words like freedom, for example, makes it completely impossible to even think about the concept of freedom, to understand what freedom means. This would be the deterministic version, but I'd argue Orwell was suggesting something more subtle and perhaps more sinister, making these thoughts more complicated to form. If you don't have a simple word for freedom, you can still think about it, but it becomes more awkward or challenging, requiring longer explanations and more mental effort. And when expressing rebellious thoughts becomes a cognitive workout, fewer people might bother. And this is more in line with this relativistic version, where language influences but doesn't control thought. The biggest problem in all the evidence is that separating language from culture is impossible. When a Japanese person is acting differently than a Brazilian person, is that because of the language or rather their cultural norms? Even if you learn a second language to perfection, you will get exposed to much of the culture that is deeply connected with the language. Still, there are some interesting findings. Russian has two distinct words for different shades of blue, while English just has, well, blue. In a study, Russian speakers were able to distinguish between lighter and darker blues faster than English speakers. However, English speakers still see the difference, they just categorize it a little slower. Not really a strong enough case for new language, new me. Here's another example. In 2002, the amazingly titled study Sex, Syntax and Semantics concluded that German speakers tend to describe a bridge as elegant and slender, while Spanish speakers might see it as strong and sturdy. Why? Because die Brücke is feminine in German, while el puente is masculine in Spanish. Great, that's a strong point of evidence that linguistic relativity exists. Well, 12 years later, the even better titled Key is a Java is a Schlüssel couldn't replicate these results. Bummer. Unfortunately, this pattern kind of repeats itself throughout linguistic relativity research. Interesting initial findings that make for great headlines, but don't hold up under scrutiny. There's this famous study suggesting that people make more rational decisions in their second language because there's more emotional distance. But is it really the language creating this distance, or is it simply that speaking a second language requires more mental effort, making us slow down and think more carefully? So, should we dismiss the whole idea? Well, not completely. First of all, the lack of evidence does not necessarily mean there is no truth to it. And while language might not exactly change our worldview, we do know that it plays a role in how we express our thought. German, for example, is famous for having words that capture complex concepts, like Schadenfreude for enjoying others' misfortune, or Fernweh for feeling homesick for places you've never been. But having a single word for these feelings doesn't mean German speakers are the only ones who experience them. It just means they can express them more efficiently. That's why bilinguals are often code switching. You suddenly switch between languages mid-conversation or even mid-sentence. It's not because your personality is changing, it's usually because one language just has a better tool for what you're trying to say at the moment. This is something I notice frequently with both my English and my German. I often struggle to express something in one or the other language. And there is something very practical for learning languages that we can take away from it. Direct translation is often not possible. When you are learning a new language, trying to translate everything word for word is a recipe for disaster. Each language has its own way of expressing ideas, and forcing one's language structure onto another just doesn't work. In case you need to translate something, first of all, use a very good translator like DeepL or ChatGPT, and more importantly, give it as much context as possible. At least the whole sentence, or better, a paragraph. If you want to make even more out of translations, use my language learning app Lengia. If you translate something, you likely don't want to translate it over and over again. One of the teeny tiny features of Lengia is that it lets you create flashcards from the translations super easily. And when you click on a word inside a story or article to define and translate it, the current, previous and next sentence will all be used as context for the translation to give you accurate results. So what do we take away from the idea of linguistic relativity as language learners? Well, learning a new language might not give you a new personality or completely rewire your brain, but it does give you new tools to express yourself. Speaking itself is kind of a form of art, and while you're still the same artist, you might have new tools and new mediums to express your art. And maybe that's what people actually mean when they say they feel different speaking another language. It's not that the language changed who they are. It's that they have access to new ways of expressing themselves. Sometimes you might feel more direct in German, more flowery in French, or more formal in Japanese. Not because the language changed your personality, but because each language offers different tools for expressions. And now that I think of it, adding new ways to express who you already are might be even more amazing. If all this talk about different languages and ways of expression got you excited to learn more than one language, first of all, I like your ambition, and second, check out my video about learning 2 languages at the same time. I share my complete strategy there, including how I'm currently balancing Spanish and Japanese. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.